You're listening to the Vari Longmuir Podcast, episode number 6. Welcome to the Vari Longmuir Podcast, and as you may have guessed, I'm your host, Vari. Since stepping away from the 9-to-5 world back in 2009, I've been a creative director, illustrator, artist, business mentor, and coach to fellow creative types. The intention with this podcast is to offer a fresh perspective about what it really means to be a working creative. I'll offer some simple strategies to add a little more joy to your days and share stories and insights from my own lessons learned, often the hard way, from over a decade of being my own boss. Now let's get into today's episode. Welcome to the podcast, guys. It's great to have you here. The concept I want to dive into this week is the idea of playing big versus playing small. I was first introduced to this idea by the author Tara Sophia Moore in her book Playing Big, which she released a couple of years ago now. For anyone who hasn't read it, I highly recommend it. It is a fascinating read for anyone in business, not just women, who are looking to play bigger and who've perhaps not been playing big in the ways that they might have first thought. My realizations that I'm going to share with you in today's episode had a profound impact on how I showed up in so many areas of my life. But most specifically, I could see exactly how this was playing out in my work as an illustrator and as a coach. So what exactly is playing big? Playing big, the way I interpret it, is when we step outside our comfort zone and allow ourselves to be seen and heard. Now, there's a key point in that statement. It's not enough just to step outside your comfort zone and try something new quietly and secretly and anonymously. We've got to do it in some public way. We can't just think about it and come up with ideas about it. We've actually got to take the action and do it in some sort of public way. This is a test to show if you're actually playing big. You'll know you're playing big if you feel emotionally exposed and open to criticism or praise when you take that specific action. It feels scary and uncertain, and that is when you know that you're playing big. So why do so many of us creative types and artists play small? Well, we play small for exactly the reason I just mentioned. Playing small shields us from emotional exposure and from criticism. I don't know many of us who wake up in the morning welcoming emotional exposure and potential criticism for the rest of the day. We don't really open our email hoping for a message from a client telling us how we might have handled their project better, or from the gallerist who says that our art isn't refined enough or contemporary enough or considered enough. So much of us is weaved into our work as creatives. We put so much of our heart and soul into it that opening ourselves up to judgment feels like such a personal attack when we receive it. It makes us doubt if our abilities and talent and creative process are any good. Playing small is the work of that primal part of our brains. It's the part that keeps us feeling safe and secure, and it likes to keep things familiar. And it's completely normal to experience this. It's how our brains have kept us alive for millions of years on this planet, so it's completely normal if you recognise that you do this as a creative or an artist. But here's the thing. The goals that we set ourselves and the dreams that we have for our work as creatives and artists out in this big world today are much closer to fear and uncertainty on the emotional scale than they are to safety and security. Now, you might be thinking, well, of course I'm playing big. Look at all these amazing projects that I've been a part of. This completely does not apply to me. If you're thinking that, then you are in good company, because this is exactly what I first thought when I heard this idea of playing small versus playing big. At least at first. On closer inspection, I began to see that where I thought I was playing big was actually just me playing small, but in disguise. Let me explain that a little bit further. There were times where I was involved in some really big projects, and the end result was really big for the collective of creatives who worked on it. But as for me personally, there was little to no potential for emotional exposure, for criticism, or for praise. If everything in the project had gone horribly wrong, then my name wouldn't necessarily be directly linked to the project. And on the other end of the scale, if everything went amazingly well in the big project, then the praise was not personally mine either. So what felt like playing big was actually just me using a big project to hide and to stay small. I see this playing small with clients on the regular. And here's an example. One of my coaching clients, Julie, was working as a designer for a major fashion brand here in Australia. We were working together in our coaching sessions as Julie was building her freelance business on the side, so it would get to the point where she could transition out of her full-time job as an employee for a brand into a full-time freelance designer who was her own boss. When Julie spoke of her job, she was super proud of how she'd been able to implement strategies to take the brand in a completely new direction and in the way that they wanted to go. She was really passionate about how she'd managed to secure things like amazing press coverage for the brand and really great sponsorship and collaboration alignments. She'd also increased their social media reach significantly, which we know is important for brands these days, especially in the fashion space. And she'd only been there a short time, so she could see where she was been able to have this really positive impact through her job with this brand. And through this, in her eyes, she was playing big. But when it came to her freelance business, there was a bit of a different story. She couldn't understand why she wasn't able to show up for herself in the same way that she was able to show up as an employee for the brand she was working for. Now, like many of us, Julie thought that this was just because she didn't have the same time to dedicate to her side hustle as she did to her job on a weekly basis. She was working in a few hours early in the morning, a few hours in the evenings, sometimes over the weekends, but she wasn't able to carve out those 35 to 45 hours a week that she was dedicating to her job as a full-time employee. She also thought that perhaps she just wasn't disciplined enough to be her own boss because she didn't have anyone to answer to. She didn't have a boss expecting things on their desk at 2 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon. So she just thought that she didn't have the willpower or the discipline to be able to be the employee that she was within the brand, to being her own boss. And one of the other thoughts that Julie had was that maybe she just was one of these people who was destined to be a really amazing A+ employee, but not a very good business owner. And I know that I've often struggled with that in my journey as being someone who has been a freelancer and been their own boss, that it can be really, really hard to keep yourself motivated. But often there are underlying things going on there that are holding us back. And it's not just about our lack of discipline or our lack of sheer willpower. Those things are finite, and we can't just blame ourselves for not having enough willpower to get through, because those are things that are not sustainable. What we uncovered with Julie was that it was actually her playing small when it came to marketing her own business. And the reason for this was there was the potential for emotional exposure, for criticism, or for praise when it was just her. And that was way too far out of her comfort zone because there was just absolutely nowhere to hide. Realising this was a complete game changer for Julie. She realised that she had been using the bigness of her job within a really established brand to feel like she was playing big, when actually she was just playing small in disguise. Awareness is everything when it comes to identifying where we're playing small. But once you realise where it's making an appearance in your life, then you can start to make changes. So if you recognise that this is perhaps coming up in your life and in your work, then don't beat yourself up about it. We all do it. We've all been there. But now that you have that awareness, we can start to make changes and implement some new strategies to move you through that into actually playing bigger in your business. So the big question, how do we start to move from playing small to playing bigger with the work that we do in the world? Now, I'm not going to lie to you. Playing bigger sounds simple, but in reality, it feels horrible and awful when we're in the middle of it and we're in the throes of it. It requires you to be willing to experience some really dark and uncomfortable emotions. These are emotions like failure, like embarrassment, humiliation, judgment from others. These are the very things that primitive part of the brain, the one I mentioned earlier, will do everything in its power to avoid. This part of our brain will tell us things like, don't give that talk. You're nowhere near qualified enough. You'll completely bomb on stage. Or it might say something like, there's no point in pitching your story to the media. There's nothing special or interesting about you. They'll laugh at you. Or it might say, don't apply to that art fair. Your work's not at that level yet. And if by some amazing chance you do get in, you'll be completely humiliated and you'll be that little fish in the big pond. Yes, all these things might happen. You might get up on that stage and completely freeze. You might not be able to utter a single word in front of an audience of people. The journalist might reply to your pitch saying that, yep, you're right, you don't have anything interesting to say and there's not a fresh new angle to be featured in a story. The art fair might completely reject your application. Or, worse still, you might make it through by some twist of fate and you completely feel out of your depth the whole time you're at the fair. But here's what I want to offer you. The worst that can happen in any of these situations is that you experience the feeling of these emotions. Now, I want you to take a second to think back on other times when you've felt these darker emotions. So think back to a time when you felt embarrassed or you felt humiliated. Now, you're still here to tell that tale, right? It didn't actually kill you. And as much as it might have felt like it was going to at the time, you're still here. And as excruciatingly uncomfortable as it was at the time, I bet if you look a little deeper, then there was some sliver of a silver lining in there that you've taken with you and has become part of your story and part of how you've gotten to where you are today. Yes, playing big comes with emotional exposure. There's no two ways about it. But if the worst that can happen is that you feel a vibration in your body, which at the end of the day, that's all an emotion is. It's just simply a vibration that's passing through our bodies. And you can recognize that the only way to achieve the goals that you have for your work is to take the risk and move through this discomfort. Then isn't it worth the risk? Being embarrassed or humiliated or failing publicly in front of your peers is only as big a deal as you allow your mind to believe it is. So take a deep breath and decide to play big this week. That's all for this week, guys. For updates, be sure and subscribe to my newsletter over at varilongmuir.com. And come follow me on Instagram. I'm at Vari Longmuir. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next week. If you enjoyed this podcast, I'd love for you to come check out my private coaching service for artists and creatives. Maybe you're struggling to commit to just one of the hundreds of ideas you have, or perhaps your confidence has taken a bit of a dive after that epic fail. Regardless of what you're struggling with, a single coaching session can give you the focus and clarity you need to make the next right move for you. Head on over to varilongmuir.com/coaching for more information and to book your session.